Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Blumenthal, and I'm an executive at ENS in the Banking and Finance Department, specializing in ESG and sustainable finance. And today I'm speaking to Carlyn Frittelli Davies and Melaney Oldenhof about sustainability and innovation and how the two ideas or two themes can work together. I'll let Carlyn and Melaney both introduce themselves, and then we will kick off with our conversation. Carlyn, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica. So as Jessica mentioned, I am also at ENS. I'm a consultant in the Natural Resources and Environment Department, and I've been practicing at ENS for almost 17 years. And I specifically focus on environmental law with a passion for waste and circularity, sustainability, also textiles and the fashion industry. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. My name is Melaney Oldenhof, and I'm working for BLab Africa. And I'm a business development associate, and I'm also a founder of What We Cherish as well. So I fill in two roles at the moment. But yeah, for BLab Africa, I work as a business development associate, and I work in programs where I actually teach African SME how to implement sustainability into their operations. As a founder of What We Cherish, I highlight African businesses that are mostly in the artisanal space, that creating a product that could be sold in the hospitality space.
Thanks, Melaney. And it's this, let's call it entrepreneurial spirit, that perhaps joins the three of us as well. Carlyn and myself have been involved in ENS's Sustainability and Impact Practice Group. And as part of that practice group, we've had a specific focus on sustainable fashion. And in the sustainable fashion focus window that we ran earlier this year and also last year, that's where we first met Melaney and her business, What We Cherish, which is one of the businesses that we've been working with in order to help promote SMEs and MSMEs and their growth in the African market. So I think all of us are known to each other now, and also very excited about the opportunities for Africa in the sustainability space. Given the perhaps bruising year that the sustainability agenda has had in 2025, I feel like before we start our discussion and we debate what the business case is for innovation and for sustainability, perhaps it's worth just touching briefly on whether sustainability is still a relevant topic to be discussing today. As we know, the concept of ESG really dates back to 2004, 2005, when the term was first coined in the context of the investment analysis. And really that was a realization that factors other than traditional financial factors could have a real impact on a business. And those sometimes mispriced or overlooked factors, the environmental factors, the social factors, and the governance factors, could affect an investment in a particular business. And so the inquiry the discussion at the time was whether these E, S, and G factors that fall under that acronym, should be taken into account when deciding whether a particular business is a good investment. And arguably those factors, the E, S, and the G factors, continue to be relevant today, notwithstanding all of the political noise that has arisen around that term. In 2015, as we all know, the Paris Agreement was signed by the nations, the nations who ratified it at the time. And that agreement really perhaps kick-started the global effort to focus on decarbonization and to ambitiously work towards halting global warming and slowing down the negative effects on our economies and our countries and our citizens that we hoped to not have to experience. As we've seen since 2015, there's been a flurry of regulatory intervention by various governments around the world. And in fact, in Africa, we've had some really ambitious policy intervention and some really impactful policy instruments passed by different governments to drive sustainability and the incorporation of sustainability considerations into business, as well as the strengthening of our economies to ensure that they are resilient to the real world impacts that we know we are currently suffering and will continue to suffer. So notwithstanding all of that, as I mentioned, as we know, at the beginning of 2025 and the start of the Trump administration, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and we've also seen recently in Europe a cooling or a backing off of previously ambitious, particularly decarbonization commitments, and also commitments to fund decarbonization, adaptation, and mitigation efforts in the developing world. So it becomes a bit of a tricky time if you only look at it from a policy perspective and from what governments are doing. But if we bring it down to the real world and we see the efforts being made within countries to adapt to a changing environment, to ensure that their particular businesses operating within those countries are more resilient to the change in climate that we are experiencing, are more sustainable in the way in which they interact with both the workforce that is part of that business, the community that the business has an impact on, as well as its environmental context, then we can see that actually, despite all the noise, sustainability is alive and well, and perhaps more so in Africa and other developing nations, where we have in fact always had to take E, S, and G considerations into account as a way of doing good and relevant business within our countries. So perhaps maybe I'll start with my first question, and Melaney, perhaps I'll ask you first. Do you think there is a business case for innovation that drives sustainability, and can you give us some examples?
Yeah, and thank you. I can. To jump into what you are saying, that the US is, stepping out of the Paris Agreement, and I still think that sustainability remains extremely important if you're looking at it from an African lens, which is where we are located. I mean, Africa is highly vulnerable for climate change, for droughts, for floods, for unpredictable rains, and food insecurity as well, that directly affects small businesses and communities. So I do think that sustainability isn't just a choice. It's also part of kind of risk management, if you look at it from that kind of way. With the program that we're working on, obviously B Corp certification, you see that investors are also prioritizing it still, impact investing, ESG funding, value-driven capital or venture capital are growing really fast and are still growing. So startups with strong sustainable strategies are more likely to be funded and to scale in the future in their growth. So yes, I think even though America is stepping out, it's not the view for the rest of the world, and also doesn't always mean that it's the right decision that they have made across the world. So also, if you look at it from a regulation point of view, and you look at, for instance, the EU, governments are implementing stricter environmental and social regulations. So any entrepreneur that builds on sustainability also will avoid in the future maybe carbon taxes or any other penalties that are being created by the overseas. So I think to really be standing out and to be resilient, I definitely think sustainability is still a very important subject.
And continues to make good, sorry, Melaney, I was just going to say, continues to make good business sense, regardless of what the global pressures might be indicating.
Yeah, and also I think also if you look at just very simple examples, like for instance, energy efficiency, right? Reducing waste. So let's look at energy efficiency. Even I just went to the launch of the Sustainability Academy from Standard Bank, and the head of sustainability was basically giving a very easy example that is very easy to understand. If you are a company A and you are using fossil fuels to, for instance, support your manufacturing part of your business, and then you are company B that maybe takes out a loan to put on solar on their roof. In the beginning, they will still be paying off every year. The fossil fuel price goes up with 12%. Now, after 5 years, company B has paid off their solar. They're basically off the grid. They can function now fully on sun energy, which is what we have in Africa. And they can now use that cost and that money to reinvest into another part of their operation. So I think that's a very easy example of also showing how it can work in your advantage from like a cost perspective, and not so much from this concept perspective of like, oh, we need to do good for planet and environment. Just even from a business growth perspective, sustainability can make you more resilient as an organization.
Particularly if you take a longer view and you don't only fixate on that upfront investment necessary to your infrastructure to get you there.
Right. And then I think also if you look at it from a customer point of view, we say people are voting with their wallets. They want products and services that do good, that do no harm. I mean, everybody is nowadays aware with the transparency of like social media where we are at. We know climate change is happening. Younger generations know climate change is happening. That is your customer for the future as well. So you also have to look at that. I think there's like a research from PricewaterhouseCoopers from PwC that is saying that 80% of the customers would actually like, there's like a global trend basically of customers wanting to know if the product is doing harm or if it has a positive impact. So from that point of view, if you look at it from almost a marketing point of view or from your customer point of view, it differentiates your brand, right? And it also builds credibility as your brand to either be certified, either if it's fair trade, doesn't have to be B Corp, but fair trade, B Corp, any other carbon neutral certifications help you stand out in crowded markets as well.
And perhaps just picking up on that and going across to Carlyn, so you're talking about one of the levers being consumer preference and consumer requirements, essentially, that products meet these requirements in order to remain relevant. But Carlyn, perhaps you can talk a little bit about, from a regulation perspective, that's another driver that continues to require businesses to invest and focus on sustainability.
Thanks, Jess. I totally agree. Regulation is also building to a point where it has very practical application. And a great example is extended producer responsibility. And so we look at many industries who now have to comply with extended producer responsibility regulations in South Africa, including single-use plastic, packaging, batteries, electric and electronic goods. And the basis for this legislation, it has already sort of taken place overseas in Europe, and South Africa has learned quite a lot from what's happened overseas and implemented its own regulations. And the main reason behind it, well, it's twofold. One is that we don't have a lot of landfill capacity anymore, so you can't throw everything away to our landfills because we have a very real constraint there. And secondly, just as Melaney was referring to, the consumers, it's the fact that you can't, as a business, as a producer of an item, keep on putting obligations on your consumers. They are very aware of the impacts, not only on the environment, but on their own lifestyle that products have. And so what the extended producer responsibility regulations require is that companies, in producing their products, focus on the whole life cycle of their product. You can't delegate your responsibility for disposal to your consumers anymore. So it's focusing on products that will have a longer lifespan, or when they do reach the end of their lifespan, can be disposed of in a way that's easy for the consumer or easy for the generator or the producer of that product itself. And so it's a very real example of something that is rooted in sustainability and circularity. The notion that you can't just stick to a linear economy where you just produce and throw things away. There has to be a sense of using things for as long as you can, which customers now understand the impact and also don't expect to have to take on that responsibility anymore. And in Europe, very recently in September, they have also extended or amended the waste directive for food waste and for textiles. And from a textile perspective, any producers who put textiles or clothing onto the European market will have to comply with an EPR regulation. So all the member states in Europe will have to put in place EPR regulation for textiles specifically. And so any company, whether it's produced in China or South Africa, will have to comply with those EPR regulations in Europe. And again, it's forcing producers to actually look at the life cycle of their products and how it impacts community, the environment, their consumers, their own business operations. So it's no longer a nice to have or something you can use for marketing, but it's something that's required. And even on the marketing side, this then also pushes greenwashing and the fact that you can't just mention, oh, this is eco-conscious or we produce it in a factory that is off the grid. A lot of the regulation, as Melaney has mentioned, is now requiring actual support for those type of representations that you put into the media. So again, regulation is really driving what companies say about sustainability.
And as we see more and more regulation being published, because certainly despite developments in Europe and the US, we continue to see regulation being promulgated in Africa. And as the regulation requirement or burden grows, obviously there's a bit of a balance there between the burden that's placed on small and emerging businesses, because we know we do also want to hit sustainable development goals like employment and poverty alleviation, and we need job creation and business for that. So we need an environment that allows for that. But we are also in a space where we continue to see new regulation like the EPR regulation that you've been describing, and whether it's promulgated in country or elsewhere with one of our trading partners, it continues to have an impact on business. So to go back to the beginning of this discussion, there's just another reason why sustainability and grappling with sustainability within a business and what that means for a particular business in a particular sector is so important.
Yeah,
But
and especially if you're an exporter or if you want to export to overseas, I know that the EU has introduced rules on tax carbon intensive imports. So you will need to look at it from that point of view. And even if you're a smaller company, but you want to work towards the growth of maybe exporting on some point, you will have to meet those sustainability standards or face the extra costs that come with it. So it's not just the sustainability standards, but obviously also meeting, yes, environmental, but also labor and safety standards that are also included in entering these markets that you would like to go to.
Exactly. And we know that no market operates in isolation, and all of our markets are very much interconnected. So no matter how small a business, it will inevitably have a place in a supply chain or a value chain, which touches on a larger business or contributes to a larger business, which may be affected by these types of regulations that we've been discussing. So besides perhaps these, let's call it pressures on businesses in order to become more sustainable, I mean, I think some of these drivers also create opportunities for sustainable business and opportunities for, similar to the example I guess you were sharing, Melaney, for businesses to set themselves up in a resilient way and take advantage of perhaps the consumer trend towards requiring more sustainable products. Perhaps let's talk a little bit about some of the examples where businesses have managed to harness sustainability as a way to create growth and further business opportunities for themselves.
Right. I mean, I would just even recommend to go to the to the blabafrica.net website, because you can actually find the African certified companies, and it's very nice to look at those companies and see, because it's in all kind of sectors, right? We are in over 161 sectors. But for instance, to give you an idea, M-Kopa in Kenya provides off-grid energy to low-income households. So that's like a new way of using sustainability to also serve communities. There is, for instance, sustainable, especially in the cocoa industry. There's a company in Uganda that's B Corp certified that really looks at, there's a lot of child labor that happens in the chocolate industry. I know there's also just been a documentary that has been made on it, but basically if you like to buy cheap chocolate, you can almost assume it's like fast fashion that there is child labor involved. So there's, for instance, Choconelli in the Netherlands that creates chocolates that is for sure that there's no child labor involved, for instance. So there's like different ways, what you say also with like the social impact part that is very important, especially in Africa where communities are so important. And you can, what I said, I very much believe that you can do good for people and for planet, and the people part is obviously the social part. Then also, if you look at what we cherish, we specifically focus on small businesses that often have a community impact. So, for instance, they will create baskets in Mozambique, or they use recycled materials. There's another company, Sealand Gear. It's a South African company that has grown out to they now have also retail brick and mortar stores in South Africa, where they started off using kind of recycled banners to create bags. And then when they started growing, they were like, okay, how do we create kind of like consistency even with the products that we are offering? So now they have swapped from using those recycled banners actually on the inside of the bag. So that way they're still using recycled materials and can actually grow as a company, as a retail organization. I've seen in Africa like recycled plastic bricks, where it reduces like construction waste or creates like low cost durable housing. So yeah, there's a lot of companies out there, and it's actually very amazing if you start diving into it, that there's companies that are really proving that you can do good and be profitable.
An incredible innovation of using products
Yes.
that perhaps were waste or didn't have a use, diverting them from a landfill to a utilitarian outlet, essentially.
Right, exactly.
And Carlyn, do you perhaps want to highlight any opportunities for sustainable business?
I think a great opportunity is just building the trust with consumers as well. Again, not leaning into or avoiding rather greenwashing. There's an opportunity to really have support from the discerning customers who now there's so much information and knowledge about the impacts of products. And so you get, as much as it may not be the majority of consumers yet, there is a very strong push for a particular type of consumer. I almost see it as like a cult almost, but in the best way possible, that will support a brand and really hold them to prove what they are sort of representing. And it's an opportunity because you really build quite a strong relationship with your consumers when you are open and honest about your business, the good and the bad, because sustainability is not always easy. And so sometimes you do hit hurdles, but I think being open about the difficulties and honest with your consumers also shows that, we're not perfect, but we're trying our best. And I've seen it in two different ways. An example recently, Me&B, which is a local South African fashion brand, and they bring very trendy items for all sizes, and they're very exciting and fun. But because of the growing concern around fast fashion from Shein and Temu, some customers have almost accused Me&B of just importing items from China and basically putting fast fashion, low quality onto the market, when in fact it's not the case. And it's just really interesting because it opens up discussions, and again, very open discussions where consumers learn a lot. So then the feedback is, no, we import certain items from China based on a technology and quality perspective. There are just some items that we simply can't produce in South Africa, but where we can, we produce locally. I think at the moment they support 14 female-owned cut measure trim CMTs across the country, which is a massive investment into South African local manufacturing. And so the fact that, we can't get everything and there are some items that are imported, they're open and honest about it. And at the end of the day, sustainability, a large component is that transparency and that clarity about what impacts there are from the business side. So that's definitely an opportunity to walk with your consumers and share what you're going through, and it really builds that trust, and something that's quite difficult to break. And similarly, where you have a business who shows, like Sorry for Change, who produces beautiful garments from donated saris, there as well, you're showing that you don't always have to have raw materials. You can create these beautiful garments from something that is seen as a waste. And again, it's just showing a different type of product. And once the customers are on board with that, it's really interesting to see how that loyalty builds with the brand.
And it's interesting to think about, I mean, these businesses that you're describing, they are using sustainability as an opportunity for growth within their business. And yet they are focusing almost automatically or intuitively on the E, the S, and the G, not because a law has told them they have to, but because they've built sustainable businesses and it's almost inherent within their business philosophy. So thinking about creating jobs, and you mentioned, local creation and local work opportunities for people in that space. There's that social element of it, but then there is also the environmental element of diverting waste and also producing locally to cut down on carbon emissions. And none of this is done because a mandatory rule was placed on these businesses. It's rather an evolution of the business into this burgeoning gap, or this opportunity to come to market in a better and a different way.
Yeah, and it also reflects like a holistic commitment, right? In a way, what you're saying, not just environmental, but also social and governance. Another example, what we are seeing now quite a lot is like the wine industry, which is very big in South Africa. For instance, Johnny's End became the first South African winery and vineyard to achieve meeting these high standards for social and environmental performance. And the way how they did is like they started off in 2014 with putting solar. So they were one of the first early adapters in the SA wine industry. Then they also planted over 10,000 spekboms, which is like a succulent, like native to South Africa, on their farm, which acts as a strong carbon sponge, basically. They use a drip irrigation system, which is much more water efficient than using sprinklers. So it's also a big educational part in it, where like maybe you just don't know, right? Like you're saying, these kind of effects are also positive effects for the business, not just actually for environment, but also for their own business, because they can they plant. I went to their vineyard, and they plant like between the vine rows, they plant like crops. It's almost like weeds, which helps prevents like soil erosion, which improves like the nutritions in the soil and kind of reduce evaporation, which is like things that, especially in agriculture, often comes back as something where you can't reuse the soil because of like the chemicals that often are used, and then the soil is basically completely unusable for a while to kind of recover. So they do that recovering system already at the same time as that they are having the vines grow. So it's very interesting that if you kind of look back on like the old days, almost like how people were doing things, we're kind of going back to that because we're realizing that that was the better way. And industrialization hasn't been always that positive for the earth and for the planet as well.
But I like the point you're highlighting as well, though, that sustainability is a journey. So it's not something that a business can pivot to overnight. It's something that a business and the management of a business needs to engage with and needs to iteratively deploy within their operations to ultimately, I suppose, create a business that can run sustainably and resiliently, but is also profitable. Because at the end of the day, this needs to be a profitable enterprise. Otherwise, there's no financial sustainability in that for these various businesses that we've been discussing. Carlyn, maybe I can ask you from your work within the fashion space, whether you think there is a green premium, essentially, that businesses who have put that amount of work and effort into ensuring that their product is sustainably produced, whether they are able to demand a green premium from consumers and whether consumers will pay for that?
It's almost an assumption that people often think if it is sustainable, it's more expensive, which is not always the case. Or I think the cost is something that needs to be unpacked a lot more. You can't compare a brand who is focusing on paying their customers a good wage and using products and designing products that will last longer and being very open about their whole process with a company that is pushing costs down to pay workers as little as possible and use the cheapest products. And I think that's often been sort of a problem. So the starting point is incorrect if you're going to try and compare all products to one another across the board. You can't do that. And so sustainability is not, it may seem more expensive or sustainable products from a pure purchasing perspective, but you have to understand what goes behind that. And a great example, as I mentioned, Sorry for Change, it's one of the brands that we actually incubate at ENS, so we're providing legal support. And to see how their operations function and why things may be more expensive, but they are paying their consumers better and they are focusing on recycling something that would go to waste. But in that, they are building skills. And so you're building skills within your business and for people who are unemployed. And so you can't, take advantage of that unemployment sort of demographic that you're working with and pay them next to nothing just so that you can mark up your item and make a lot of money. And I think people often think that's the case, that brands are charging a lot of money just to have a big profit, when it's the opposite. It's usually that the right people are getting the money that they should. And it sort of leads to, again, the basis that we can't look at, sustainable products are expensive and other products are affordable. Affordability is quite a complex thing to consider, especially in South Africa and Africa, where we have people who really struggle, who are unemployed and poor, and then we have high end who, the 5 or the 1% who make enough money, who can actually make better choices and support businesses who are doing the right thing. And I often say, particularly in the fashion space, that I don't have a problem with someone who has a choice between a dress or putting food on their table. That's a completely different consideration that you have to understand. Whereas someone who's deciding whether they're going to buy 20 dresses from a cheap company or one dress from a company that's actually paying their workers and using products that will ensure that the product lasts, those are two very different considerations and different types of demographics that you're looking at. So it's not a simple question to understand or to discuss, but I think we need to discuss it more. We can't just simply say, well, I want affordable clothing and I don't care if the garment workers are stuck in a cycle of poverty because I just want my cute little outfit. So I think it's something that we should be discussing more. And then also to your question of whether consumers are willing to pay for that green premium, there's definitely growth in that. There was a recent study by one of my colleagues or friends, and she said that they looked at women, I think in their 30s to 40s, who have disposable income of about 10 to 20,000 Rand. And whether there's always the pay say gap. So you say you'll support something that is sustainable, but when push comes to shove, you don't do it. And her research in South Africa actually showed that women who have that disposable income say they will support brands who are more conscious, and they actually do. So that's really encouraging to hear that type of research, because the opposite often happens, although Melanie's also mentioned where those numbers are changing. And looking to the youth, I think they are so aware of the terrible impacts that our convenience and our sort of cheap products, what impact that has had, that they are certainly willing to look for other opportunities and ways to be more sustainable. So I think things are changing, but we need to have discussions and be more open about it.
Yeah. So it really sounds to me as if there's such a fertile environment for a sustainable business, because you've got these changing attitudes that you describe in Carlyn, and that you're backing up with consumers who are actually using their buying power to make these choices. We've got the regulatory shifts that we're seeing around the world And then we've got the point that Melanie's making about how sustainable, making one's operations more sustainable actually makes good business purely from a profit perspective, because infrastructure put in place now, which might have a cost attached to it, certainly will save money in the future. And again, against all of that, we have the real world changes that we're experiencing, increased heat days, changes in rainfall, lack of ability to rely on ecosystem services that we once took for granted. Businesses who aren't preparing for the future will eventually suffer the consequence of that. So against this backdrop, Melaney, maybe a question for you from a governance perspective. Emerging businesses, new businesses that start out with these really great intentions around sustainability and these ideals that they wish to build their business around. How can a business like that really embed sustainability into their governance structure?
Okay, well, it starts with your mission, I think, and your DNA. I mean, they say if you want to build a house, you need a good foundation, right? So it starts with the foundation, first of all, to be like, what are you really standing for? So, for instance, if I look at it from a What We Cherish point of view, where we're still in startup phase, our mission is basically to support mostly like women-owned brands and companies that make their products sustainable and kind of offering it in a luxury way, because I'm basically saying like we think that African products can also be luxury and sustainable at the same time. So then it really starts with your base of like, okay, that means that the companies that we work with or that our supply chain also needs to basically adapt to the values that we have as organizations and the ESG requirements that we are setting as an organization, right? And so that's why I'm saying, like, I really think it starts with your foundation. So then if you have suppliers, how do you vet them, right? What is part of your vetting your vetting process? So is there a clear purpose and values that you have in place, and really define your company's mission around profit and purpose? I think that is like a starting point. So if we are saying like we are creating a premium wine while restoring ecosystems and supporting local communities, then you really have to use this as your DNA, and these core principles will help with that. So I think that's the starting point, especially for small businesses. And then from there, it grows further, right? That if your supply chain grows, then how strict are you with the regulations that you are setting for your suppliers? But I would say that's the starting point.
And at least for small businesses, I think one advantage that they have as emerging businesses is that they start with a clean slate. So they can embed that mission into their governance documents perhaps more easily than a larger business that's been around for a long time and is needing to pivot into more sustainable operations.
And also it starts with your board, right? It starts like at the leadership level. So even a small startup can create a governance structure in a way where and that's something that we really say then, that your advisory board or your founders council or whoever is involved in your company is on the same page, and that you actually put that on paper as well. There's not something that you just say, but you're like, we got this in paper, and this is like an actual legal document that you also have to sign, that we are all agreeing that we are standing for this. So I think that also gives a form of accountability for like clear roles and responsibilities and decision-making authority, especially once you start growing, that they're still tied to like ESG goals. So yeah, that's something that ENS, for instance, is really helping me with. Like, how do you put it in place? Because that is very new for a lot of businesses, right? And how do you put that in place, and how do you put that into a contract? I think that's like a very important one for entrepreneurs that are maybe in the purpose-driven space, or that are starting up and like, I want to do this, but like, how do I do this? Because I'm still small. But actually, when you start small and you have it built in, it becomes so much easier once you grow, because then you don't have to circle back to the beginning almost to say like, oh, oops, the foundation we did was actually not with very, very strong bricks. But if you start that strongly, then you just grow from there. And then I would say life become easier for the future if it comes to sustainability.
And important to have that guiding light, as you say, when your business grows. So to have started off the right foundation. I mean, certainly we've seen that with the startup clients that we've worked with, as well as the more established businesses who have perhaps almost retrospectively had to go through that process to ensure that they align what they say with what they've actually committed to in terms of their governance arrangements.
Yeah, and also one of the things that we really clearly see in like the programs part, for instance, for BLab Africa, is that a lot of SME and businesses have no idea how to measure their impact. I think we talk about impact, but like how do you actually measure the impact, and how do you, like carbon footprint, water use, community impact, and how do you track it? How do you use that information, that data, as like, oh, this is our strengths, these are our weaknesses, here we can build on, and then report that progress? Because you see it in the bigger organizations where they have ESG departments and where they have sustainability managers, but like smaller companies, they don't have that. And so it's quite important also for the founders and for the board and leadership to understand what actually also measuring impact means. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, sorry, Carlyn, go ahead.
I was going to say, just touching on that, exactly to your point, the data collection is often really important, but very overwhelming. And I know BLab Africa have a great product, or at least a free product, where you can measure a lot of those things, but also, again, it's quite overwhelming. There are a lot
it's
of
still
aspects to
rigorous.
cover. Yeah. And what we did with some of our incubators, and again, I refer to Sorry for Change, we kind of did an even more basic assessment tool just for them to understand and get their head around it. And I focused on the environmental impacts. And as you said, it's very practical, but it can be overwhelming. So we just took day-to-day impacts. And so we set up a document where we said, okay, what is your electricity use on a monthly basis? Are you implementing any ways to use less electricity, maybe using daylight as much as you can? And then for future, do you think you would ever be able to get solar instead of using your general electricity provided by Eskom? So it's just providing very practical tools and ways to understand your impact. And it's so interesting just to see the understanding kind of grow, and also the sense of overwhelm to fall away, because it's just starting where you are. As Jess said, and you've said, it's a journey. And particularly for small businesses, you have the opportunity to really focus and maneuver a lot better than big corporates. So finding what your sort of baseline is as early as you can is a great tool. Just measuring what your waste is. And from an environmental perspective, it's normally all of the elements. And we based our document on things like the ISSB standards. There are standards for every industry, and it just shows what impacts you should look at. So for the sort of accessories and textile industry, it's looking at your water use, looking at what chemicals you use, and where you are using a chemical that is hazardous, can you move to something alternative in the future? What waste you are producing, can you repurpose that waste? Then also electricity, as I mentioned as well, energy use, and then down to your climate sort of impact, a simple thing like what transport are your employees using, or are you using? And so when you kind of break it down into those daily activities, it's a lot easier to measure your impact. So I think it's just, again, talking about it and understanding so that we can take away some of that overwhelm. And if you start there, then you can get to the point where you can fill in the incredible resource that BLab has.
So I think, I mean, obviously we've been talking about the business case for sustainability, and we've been focusing on small, medium, maybe even micro enterprises, startup enterprises in a South African and a slightly broader African context. And of course, what we're saying could apply to larger businesses, developed businesses, businesses across all sectors, although we've been focusing quite a bit on the fashion sector at the moment in this discussion. And perhaps this discussion has been useful for some, even looking at it through that very limited lens at a particular type of business, a startup or an emerging business in a particular sector. All of these principles that we've been talking about, the opportunity that sustainability offers a business, the risks that lack of attention to sustainability poses to a business, all of these are transferable and relevant, in fact, across all sectors of our economy. So thanks very much, Carlyn and Melaney, for the discussion today, and for sharing your insights and your experiences. It's been great chatting to you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's been great.